Good evening. My name's John OLoughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. Tonight, we're reading once again from the book Population Control: How Corporate Owners Are Killing Us by Jim Marrs. And as you know, I've read, say, about 10 or so different parts of this book, skipped over a number of them. But tonight we're going to cover something that I don't think I've covered before in our show before, and that is uh, the militarization of the police. And what a topic that is, given what's happened since he wrote this book. And now we're seeing our police themselves being assaulted by hoodlums that maybe be with BLM or Antifa, but definitely people that are against the police. It seemed to me that the police were standing down, but that might change any day now, as the police are certainly very, very powerful, and even powerful to the point of having the power of military force. So let's read what Jim Marrs has to say on the militarization of police. But before we do, I do want to put a plug in for our sponsor tonight. Our sponsor tonight, Belvoir Fruit Farms Organic Ginger Beer. The best ginger beer money can buy. And you can get it here in the quart bottle, and it is snappy ginger beer. It gives you that ginger boost that everybody talks about. Don't go for any imitations. Belvoir Organic Ginger Beer is your answer. And I'd like to thank Belvoir Fruit Farms for their kind sponsorship of our show tonight. Here's to you. Chapter 16, The Militarization of Police. Politicians refuse to use police or military forces to fortify and protect U.S. borders. But within the country's boundaries, it seems that anything goes. Police forces are being armed with surplus war materials to tyrannize the civilian population. And even some school districts are accumulating military equipment for campus police. There was a time in America when only criminals were fearful of the police, but that helpful public servant, that man in blue sworn to serve and protect, has today been replaced by a black-clad, body-armored, and heavily armed enforcement officer who generally views ordinary public citizens as perps. Increasingly, many young police officers and even entire law enforcement departments are arming and training as if they expect to be going to war with the American people. This phenomenon has been encouraged at the federal level. Much of the militarization stems from the Defense Logistics Agency, the Pentagon's largest organization for the logistical support of U.S. military services as well as civilian law enforcement. The DLA is headquartered in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Belvoir. The DLA knows its ginger beer. So, the DLA is headquartered at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and employs 27,000 people. The Defense Logistics Agency, under the 1033 program began in 1990, is charged with disposing of $28 billion worth of military equipment per year. Its Law Enforcement Support Office estimates that about 8,000 state and local police agencies have received billions in hardware since 1997. Much of this hardware became surplus as both the missions and materials of the military changed through the years. The pace of militarization increased significantly after the 9/11 attacks. Frank Scafidi, Director of Public Affairs for the National Insurance Crime Bureau, says, "The government has done a pretty good job since 9/11 of beating into our heads all of the nasty things that could befall us at any moment, from a terrorist threat. Cops like nothing more than grabbing onto some cool new, to them at least, piece of hardware, especially when it was obtained at no cost. But then what? If the gear is in the inventory and an occasion to use it develops, you can bet that it will be used. And why not?" According to Pentagon data, during the Obama years, the military combat equipment received by police departments includes 432 MRAPs, 435 other armored vehicles, 44,900 night vision goggles, sights, and lights, 533 planes and helicopters, and 93,763 machine guns. Police departments also have received nearly 200,000 ammunition magazines, thousands of pieces of camouflage, and hundreds of silencers. And the federal government provides not only weapons and heavy equipment, but also a vast array of more mundane items, including office furniture, cleaning supplies, power tools, computers, and even disparate items such as an exercise bike, a treadmill, and refrigerators. According to New York Times reporter Matt Apuzzo, the equipment has been added to the armories of police departments that already look and act like military units. Police SWAT teams are now deployed tens of thousands of times each year, increasingly for routine jobs. Masked, heavily armed police officers in Louisiana raided a nightclub in 2006 as part of a liquor inspection. In Florida in 2010, officers in SWAT gear and with guns drawn carried out raids on barber shops that mostly led only to charges of barbering without a license. Such militarization has even reached into some schools. According to an investigation by Houston, Texas television station KHOU, 10 Texas school districts have availed themselves of the free or low-cost military hardware from the Pentagon, including M16 rifles, M14 rifles, automatic pistols, tactical vests, and even military vehicles. Even though Spring Hills School District Police Chief Charles Brawner explained that such weapons would be available only to tactically trained officers in the event of an emergency, critics questioned the need for such heavy equipment. We've seen how even much less lethal devices like tasers and pepper spray get used inappropriately and end up harming children, remarked Brennan Griffin of Texas Appleseed, a group that monitors campus police practices. Citizens, outraged over such militarization, are pushing back. After hearing citizen concerns, the City Council of Davis, California, a small college town near Sacramento, directed the police chief to get rid of a $700,000 armored car. Mayor Don Wolk said, quote, "It's the kind of thing that is used in Afghanistan and Iraq. Our community is the kind of community that is not going to take well to having this kind of vehicle. We are not a crime-ridden city. When it comes to help from Washington, we, like most communities, have a long wish list, but a tank or an MRAP or whatever you choose to call it is not on that list." Even some cops are concerned. As retired New York Police Detective John Baeza puts it, "A profession that I was once proud to serve in has become a militarized police state. Officers are quicker to draw their guns and use their tanks than to communicate with people to defuse a situation. They love to use their toys, and when they do, people die. The days of the peace officer are long gone, replaced by the militarized police warrior wearing uniforms, making them indistinguishable from military personnel. William Norman Grigg, a columnist for LouRockwell.com, notes that the 1033 program specifies that any law enforcement agency receiving military equipment must use it within a year or return it. Quote, if a police department wants combat gear, it can get it, and once the department has that gear, it will use it. In fact, the feds will require that they invent a, quote, need where none exists. This helps explain why routine police calls are now treated as potential military engagements, writes Gregg. Some law enforcement agencies obtain military gear out of fear of being outgunned by criminals, while others simply want to emulate the militarized forces they see on TV and in films. Ominously, a 2014 investigation by the TV and digital network Fusion revealed that 184 state and local police departments had been suspended from the 1033 program because of missing weapons or failure to comply with guidelines. Quote, we uncovered a pattern of missing M14 and M16 assault rifles across the country, as well as instances of missing .45 caliber pistols, shotguns, and 2 cases of missing Humvee vehicles, writes Daniel Rivero and Jorge Rivas. Well, I take a second and catch my breath and think, well, I think George Webb has been reporting on this business of these arms going to police departments and then disappearing. And I wonder how that happens. Well, George Webb has been reporting on the networking, the trafficking of things like arms and trading arms for drugs and other contraband for quite some time now. And certainly the police departments don't need these arms. They don't need them within a year. That's for sure. So to see them disappear is perhaps the best thing that can happen to them, because you might benefit in some way that's not on the record, and nobody's the wiser because nobody's going to investigate. Just another aspect of George Webb's reporting that is reflected in all the books that I read. I like to point that out now and then. George works very hard, and while he takes a lot of flack, I don't know anyone that has worked harder to expose the truth than George Webb. Pardon me a second. Tim Lynch, director of the Cato Institute's Project on Criminal Justice, says the 1033 program is, quote, obviously very sloppy, and it's another reason that Congress needs to revisit this promptly. We don't know where these weapons are going, whether they are really lost, or whether there is corruption involved, unquote. Lynch found the possibility that these military weapons were being sold on the black market very unsettling. Investigations into missing weapons have been continuing into 2015. Nowhere has the militarization of police been more blatantly on display than in the violence that erupted in August 2014 in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson. Tensions there mounted following the police shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown. And when demonstrators from the black community took to the streets to protest, they were met by heavily armed and armored police in full battle gear. Jake Tapper of CNN reported that there was no violence and looting until police began to use tear gas and stun grenades. Quote, "Nobody is threatening anything," reported Tapper. "Nobody is doing anything. None of the stores here that I can see are being looted. There is no violence," unquote. Tapper turned his camera to the unit of police and added, "These are armed police with not machine guns, semi-automatic rifles, with batons, with shields, many of them dressed for combat. Now, why they're doing this, I don't know, because there is no threat going on here, none that merits this." Comparing the scene to military action in Afghanistan, Tapper reported, "There is nothing going on this street right now that merits the scene out of Bagram. Nothing. So if people wonder why the people of Ferguson, Missouri are so upset, this is part of the reason. What is this? This doesn't make any sense." Frederick Reese, writing for Mint Press News, agreed that the massive police response did more to aggravate than to improve the situation. The response, which included the targeting and arrest of journalists, is proof of the, quote, "elaborated social identity model," which suggests that a group of angry people can either be goaded into a riot or defused, depending upon how they are treated by police. The impression of the police officer screaming at the crowd with his rifle raised, as has been seen on multiple occasions in Ferguson recently, is as much responsible for the rioting as the protesters themselves, according to ESIM. It is also in part a reflection of the notion that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you treat everything as a nail. Lost in the mass media coverage of the unrest in Ferguson was a similar shooting death of 20-year-old white man in Salt Lake City on August 11th. The death also caused public demonstrations, yet the police response was quite different. Dylan Taylor, along with his brother and a cousin, were confronted by city police outside a convenience store. Ordered to stop, Taylor continued walking and was fatally shot in the chest after police claimed he reached into his waistband. The officer who shot him was, quote, "non-white," according to Salt Lake City Police Chief Chris Burbank, in response to concerns of racial profiling, given that Dylan Taylor was Hispanic. Gerald Taylor said his brother was wearing earphones and did not realize what was happening, and that Dylan was reaching for his cell phone. He got confused. He went to pull up his pants and get on the ground, and they shot him, he told the media. Adding to the questions over Taylor's death was the fact that police found no weapons at the scene and later released Taylor's brother and cousin without charges. Chief Burbank also caused concern when he announced that the policeman who shot Taylor was wearing a body camera that recorded the entire affair, but he declined to make it public, saying it would be wholly inappropriate to take the most vital piece of evidence that we have and put it out to the public prior to the officer having some due process. During the following week, demonstrators marched in Salt Lake City to protest what they felt was a wrongful shooting by police, but the comparison between this event and that in Ferguson was stark. Unlike Ferguson, there was no rioting or looting, and the police presence was kept minimal. "If we show up wearing riot gear, it says throw rocks and boulders at us," explained Burbank. "I didn't send officers out wearing riot gear to talk to the protesters who were out in front of the building yesterday." The difference in protests as well as the police response was not lost on some commentators. While friends of Taylor and some others have protested the shooting, there have been no riots or violence, no radicals streaming in to agitate, no national media interest at all, and complete indifference from the Attorney General and the President. in stark contrast to their concern for the late strong-arm robber Michael Brown, wrote Thomas Lifson in the internet publication American Thinker. It is hard to escape the conclusion that some unarmed victims of police shootings are more important to the political and media leadership of America than others. 2008 Constitutional Party presidential candidate Chuck Baldwin relates an experience that to him showed the change of attitude in the policemen of today. True story, he writes. Here in Montana, a small-town police officer who was assigned to the traffic division was asked to speak to a church group. Mostly, he gives out traffic citations for minor violations. As he began his remarks, he said, "I am a cop. I work every day among the dregs of society." Really? People who get parking tickets and speeding tickets are the dregs of society? That, my friends, is the mark of an unfolding police-state mentality. And remember, this is from the heart and lips of a professing Christian. In an open letter to my friends in law enforcement, Baldwin wrote, quote, "As honest and honorable as most of you men and women of law enforcement are, it is time that you come to grips with the fact that the current system emanating from Washington, D.C., controlling the attitudes, training, and tactics of police agencies is practically a carbon copy of history's most notorious totalitarian regimes. And if the Nuremberg trials proved anything, they proved that, quote, I was just following orders is never justification for ignoring the greater moral laws of God and nature. My dad told me that the policeman is my friend. I would still like to believe that, but it behooves my friends in law enforcement to prove it to me by personally making up your minds to vehemently resist the current trend of militarizing your profession and of turning our once free republic into a police state. After all, you want us to be your friends too, right? It's a lot of controversial stuff to think about because it's interesting. Of course, when he was writing this, it would have been the end of the Obama administration, and the people that were threatened by the police at that time were the protesters at Ferguson. And when we saw that in other incidences, Freddie, I forgot his last name, up in Baltimore, protesting against the police violence, but the police responding with militarized units and armor and this whole militarized approach. Now, what's interesting is the shoe's on the other foot. You know, now we have the folks who are believers in constitutional rights who are now going to be the protesters that are going to be under threat from the militarized police. So shoes on the other foot in a way, like I was saying the other night, it's really impossible to actually have a mass protest the way they do in Europe. We simply cannot do it because of the advanced status of the police and the way that they will just shut you right down. Plus the fact that we still don't have a center, we don't have a united core that we can build a citizen protest around, the way I believe they still do in places like Denmark, France, and Germany. The International Association of Chiefs of Police, in a 2012 report, claimed that police use of force is rare. The IACP said that less than 2% of the 40 million people who had contact with police in 2008 reported the use of force or the threatened use of force. In large part, the public perception of police use of force is framed and influenced by the media depictions, which present unrealistic and often outlandish representations of law enforcement and the policing profession, the group stated. Yet, even 2% of 40 million is 800,000, and since 2010, the U.S. Justice Department has opened more than 20 investigations into police departments across the country. 15 departments accepted consent decrees, including ones in New Orleans, Seattle, and Portland. Several other departments reached out-of-court agreements with 4 police agencies that rejected the Department of Justice findings, found themselves facing lawsuits. A March 2015 Justice Department report found the Ferguson police had established a pattern of constitutional violations due to city officials pressing for more aggressive law enforcement to generate revenues. The investigation into the Ferguson Police Department was continuing in early 2015. Critics have pointed out that the aggressiveness of police has substantially increased in recent years, concurrent with the use of military hardware. Thoughtful people wonder why police need tanks and armored cars to catch speeders, shoplifters, or burglars. A 2014 ACLU study entitled War Comes Home, The Excessive Militarization of American Policing concludes, across the country, heavily armed SWAT teams are forcing their way into people's homes in the middle of the night, often deploying explosive devices such as flashbang grenades to temporarily blind and deafen residents simply to serve a search warrant on the suspicion that someone may be in possession of a small amount of drugs. Neighborhoods are not war zones, and our police officers should not be treating us like wartime enemies. However, the ACLU encountered this type of story over and over when studying the militarization of state and local law enforcement agencies. This study substantiates the fact that police tactics nationwide are becoming unnecessarily and dangerously militarized, mostly through federal programs providing military equipment to police agencies. It also found that the use of military equipment and tactics, which is called a pervasive problem, was primarily being used against, quote, communities of color, unquote. Historians looking back at this period in America's development will consider it to be profoundly odd that at the exact moment when violent crime hit a 50-year low, the nation's police departments began to gear up as if the country were expecting invasion, and on occasion to behave as if one were underway, wrote Charles W. Cook in nationalreview.com. One example of the militarization of the nation's police force is all now a national force under the control of the Department of Homeland Security may be found in the small town of Neenah, Wisconsin. This quiet town of about 25,000 has not recorded a homicide in more than 5 years. Yet, today is the proud owner of a 30-ton MRAP combat vehicle. Neenah City Councilman William Paulnow Jr. questioned the necessity for the MRAP, but was told it was needed to protect police. Quote, who's going to be against that? You're against the police coming home safe at night? But you can always present a worst case scenario. You can always use that as a framework to get anything, he said. Somebody has to be the first person to say, why are we doing this? It is with notable irony that while U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan early on were sent into combat with old-style Jeeps and Humvees susceptible to destruction by improvised explosive devices, local police forces are now being equipped with the new armored fighting vehicles during a time of relative peace in the country. In fact, while national leaders do everything they can to reduce the number of firearms in the hands of the citizenry, Massive amounts of military hardware are being handed over to local police forces. Many wonder if this is simply a means of reusing old equipment in preparation for the purchase of newer models, or if someone is preparing for major violence in America. Some researchers find it more than coincidental that militarization of the nation's police force coincided with heightened public awareness of the globalist designs and public debate concerning what President George H. Bush described as the New World Order. It should be further noted that the aggressiveness of police has followed training by Israeli anti-terrorism experts, as will be detailed further on. All this militarization began in the 1990s when Congress, sidestepping the 1878 Posse Comitatus law that prohibits the U.S. military from policing the American public, authorized a military transfer program to aid local police against well-armed drug gangs. The delivery of military equipment continues today, although FBI statistics show crime has fallen to its lowest levels in a generation. Police departments across the nation say that they are simply preparing for worst-case scenarios by building up combat equipment. Captain Tiger Parsons of the Buchanan County Sheriff's Office in northwest Missouri, which now possesses a mine-resistant truck, says, quote, "When you explain that you're preparing for something that may never happen, they get it," unquote. But not everyone agreed. Police Chief Ronald F. Teachman of South Bend, Indiana, declined the offer of a mine-resistant vehicle for his city. Quote, "I go to schools, but instead of a war machine, I bring green eggs and ham," unquote. It is true that with the possible exception of certain large cities, the vast majority of the nation's officers have not, and most probably will not, fire a weapon in a real-life situation. But they have all been conditioned by cop shows on TV to anticipate high-speed chases and gun battles as normal daily activities. No longer do police officers present themselves at a person's door and respectfully ask questions after showing proper identification. Today, many citizens, whether guilty of some crime or not, are rudely awakened by busted down doors and pointed guns in the hands of an armored SWAT team. And I'm going to stop there. That's the end of that chapter. I do think it's very politically important that we consider now that all of these police are so, well armed and prepared militarily. It may be in order to make it impossible for us to, to contest um, elections in the future, to protest things like when we think there's fraud, or otherwise to point out what we call illegal activities on the part of government. And this overwhelming force, this overwhelming power is there to intimidate and to control people instead of to protect and serve people. And that is completely backwards and wrong, according to the America that I was taught when I went to school. Take a second and check with your chat here. Dr. Hamamoto will be hosting an alternative to the Super Bowl at 6 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. Fantastic. Thank you, Kathy Sue. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I am happy to say that tonight is Saturday night, which means that I get tomorrow off. It's Sunday, and McDuff will be attending the family stuff and taking care of all of those little things that need to get done. I'll see you Monday morning, and we've got some great guests lined up for next week, starting off with a great Harley Schlanger at 11 a.m. Monday morning, right here on McDuff Lives. Good night, and don't forget your Belvoir organic ginger beer.